Hi. So yes, I'm Ben Rich. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm the Chief Executive of Radix Big Tent, which is a horribly messy name. Basically, we're the merger of two organisations, Radix and Big Tent, both of which are aimed to be a platform for those outside the Westminster bubble to influence and input into the political debate. So this session and the work of the Democracy Network feels very comfortable to me. We've got now, I think, only about 40 minutes to solve integrity and standards in politics. So I'm going to go straight in there. It struck me a topic like integrity could mean all sorts of different things to different people. We could be talking about personal integrity, abuse of financial positions, sexual misconduct. We could be talking not just in political integrity, but the integrity of the political system as a whole, the integrity of government and of ministers. We can also be talking about leadership, for example. And rather than dictate which of those we want to talk, I'm going to hear from the panel, but I'm also hoping that there's lots of expertise in this room, and I'm very much hoping to hear from you. If we're going to do that, we're going to need to do it with people being very disciplined and very short, and I'm going to start by asking the panel to be disciplined, but we'll then hopefully be able to have a bit of discussion around the room, but only if you're equally disciplined. So we'll do that. I think, lastly, I want to say, just by way of introduction, I want us all to try and focus not just on what's desirable, because there's an awful lot of change which is desirable in this area, but what we think might be achievable. And so that will be my big challenge to everybody who's speaking. Very quickly, introducing the panel, sitting immediately to my left is Dr. Sue Hawley. She's the Chief Executive of Spotlight on Corruption, spent 20 years campaigning in this area, campaigning on the UK's role in facilitating global corruption. We have sitting next to her, Daniel Bruce, who's the Chief Executive of Transparency International UK. I'm guessing in this environment, I don't need to introduce Transparency International UK, so I'll let you add anything that you want to about them, but very much leading campaigners in this area. Prior to joining Transparency as their Chief Executive, broadcast journalist, and prior to that, Programme Director with UNESCO. And sitting on the my far left, purely in terms of where he's seated, is Lord Tyler, Paul Tyler. He was youngest county councillor in 1964, spent a very large number of years in the House of Commons and then in the House of Lords, recently retired. And the book, which Jesse mentioned, was written by himself together with Nick Harvey, who was former government minister and MP, and together bring huge expertise of people who've actually been on the inside of the system in terms of how it works. So with that by way of introduction, when Rishi became Prime Minister, he said that he regarded it as part of his mission to reintroduce integrity, professionalism into public life. Daniel, how's he doing? Mark out of 10.
I'm not going to give you a number. Good afternoon, everyone. Transparency International is UK is part of a global coalition, the anti-corruption coalition of Transparency International chapters in 100 countries around the world, for those who might not have heard of us. Prime Minister Sunak has nibbled at the edges of this agenda in our assessment. When he entered number 10 Downing Street, he had some pretty smart roadmaps in front of him to allow him to deliver some really meaningful reforms in terms of the standards oversight at the heart of government, with ministers right up to the Prime Minister. Many of you will be familiar with the work of the Committee on Standards in Public Life and their seminal 2021 report, which advised 34 reforms in this area. And these were very much echoed by the Commons PACAC Committee and elements of the Boardman Review, which followed the Greensill lobbying scandal as well. just before the summer recess, government slipped out an announcement to adopt a very modest number of those reforms, principally around transparency of lobbying, who is trying to influence government and for what, and some strengthening of ACOBA, the oversight body for post-ministerial appointments. But the really tough piece, where government has essentially rejected most of the recommendations of CSPL and others, is around standards regulation and oversight of government itself, the safeguards around ministerial behaviour and indeed the Prime Minister's behaviour of any political stripe of any government. And this is the really tough bit, I think, frankly, for politicians to have to embrace when they are the incumbents. We understand that. But let's be clear that that is a choice. Time, public money and effort has gone into these inquiries and these reviews and produced very sensible evidence-based recommendations for reform that would start to put back some of the pieces of the puzzle to rebuild trust after the turbulent few years that we've had in Westminster politics. And so it's a political choice not to embrace those reforms. I'm sure we can explore why that might be over the course of the discussion this afternoon. But what I would say in closing is that having the rules and the regulations there really are the safeguard, they're the backstop. They should be there for when things go really wrong. I think there's so much that we need to do and that we need to see, and we need our Westminster politicians in particular to take responsibility for, which is about political culture and ideology and taking preventative measures to stop the kind of drip of scandal that we've seen in the first place, so that the rules themselves are actually less needed. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's useful. And I'm taking that at about 4 at the moment, but I won't hold you to it. So where would you put the performance over the last year?
Thank you. Yes, I think the bottom line is this is just not a priority for the government. And there may be many reasons for that. It may be that it's not seen as politically salient. That at the end of the day, even though, as Jessie said, there's, actually people really care about political corruption, it's not the thing they get out of bed to vote for. And I think there's a calculation going on there about, is this something, if we do steps on it, is it actually going to make a difference to the voters? And so I think there's been possibly complacency. I mean, when we've talked to the former anti-corruption champion, he's been trying to say, when are you going to do this? How are you going to speed things up? And he's just getting a complete blank wall. And I think you see this in the kind of delays in not just, it took about 6 months for this response to the report to be made after Sunak came into power. It came with no timeline. How long does it take to write a deed of undertaking for ministers that, they're not going to engage in, wrongful behavior after they've left government or lobbying or breached the rules. And you see it, they've yet to appoint an anti-corruption champion. They've yet to make an anti-corruption strategy. I think it's just a picture that it's not a priority. And I think possibly the more that the opposition make it a priority, the less it becomes attractive for the government to actually do anything about it. Can I just say, well, you wanted a bit of disagreement, Ben, I'll be really quick. But Daniel made a point about this is a political choice. And I do agree it is a political choice, but that is not how the government and civil service see it. And they think that they have adopted what is the constitutional position. And the constitutional position is that the PM is effectively king and gets to rule the roost with his ministers. And there's lots of constitutional experts who disagree, but I'm just putting that on the table because they have come, that is their reason for not doing this more ambitious reform that Daniel said, which is, it would bring the courts into Parliament. So they have a range of constitutional points that they're making, which is why they're not doing, which we have to, I think, overcome if we want to get this more ambitious reform.
So that's very helpful, and we'll come straight back to that. I want to bring Paul in next, though. And what I'm hearing from both Daniel and Sue is just not a priority for the government. Is that your experience?
Absolutely my experience. It won't surprise you to hear that I'm an optimist. You can't be a liberal without being an optimist. And I honestly thought that when he stood outside number 10, we actually were going to have a change of gear, a change of attitude. Isn't it extraordinary in terms of integrity, that the first person who's resigned from Parliament on an issue of principle was that Chris Skidmore yesterday. We haven't had any other resignations that I can think of in this whole Parliament since 2019, where somebody's resigned on an issue of principle. It's usually misbehavior of various sorts. I think that's a damning indictment of the whole climate in which this government exists. It isn't just one person, it is the whole climate that's there.
Rishi might argue with you as to whether he resigned on principle, but we'll have a discussion around that.
Okay, we'll do that afterwards. At least it looked like principle. If there's something I've missed, maybe the boundary changes, that's significant too. But I think it is the best resignation of this Parliament. I think we might agree on that one. Now, look, there's an extraordinary connection between a lot of what's gone badly wrong over the last 4 years with the issue of political money, which all of us here, I think, would. Let me just illustrate that very quickly. Because a huge amount of the money that will be spent in this general election year will come from the national parties because of the changes in the law, which I was involved in, trying to stop. Each individual person who is elected will actually be more answerable in terms of their election and therefore their future election and their political survival and their parliamentary career, which may be their only career that they've got, will be dependent on the money that's come from the party. This has changed the whole balance between the executive and the legislature. All over the world, Brits go and tell them to get that right. Make sure that, that the executive is answerable to Parliament, to the Assembly, whatever it may be called. But in this country, it's gone dramatically in the opposite direction. That's what our book is all about, really. It is because we're slipping towards what Lord Hailsham many years ago called an elective dictatorship. And money, or strictly speaking, it's the quote is actually, the love of money is the root of all evil. How about that to start with?
That's very great. Let me just chuck that back at you, Daniel. Then is that the root of the problem as that you're seeing, or is there something broader going on? And also that need for politics to fund itself, is that the obstacle? Do you agree with Sue's analysis as to whether it's really a constitutional argument or this is just excuse?
I'll take Sue's point first. I mean, Sue and I generally agree with one another, so it's quite difficult to disagree for the purposes of colour. But I mean, yes, I think both of those things are true. I think it's convenient that there are strong constitutional arguments against it, but I think my view is that all of that whole set of recommendations is put into that constitutional bucket. I don't think CSPL would have made all of those recommendations without an expert view on that, but I accept that it's a knotty issue, and that that's part of the problem. But I don't think it's all of it. I do still think there's an element of political choice there. We are very concerned about the corrupting influence of big money in UK politics. We feel that all of the limits around this are going in the wrong direction in terms of the amount of campaigning financing that parties can have as their ceiling in the election campaign, and in terms of essentially what is a Wild West in terms of the size of political donations that are allowed limitless in this country, which is different to relative comparable democracies in different parts of the world. I think it is part of a wider apparatus that invites patronage, where there are strong links, for example, between the last 20 or so donors that gave more than £3 million to the current party of government, who also find themselves with a seat in the House of Lords. If there was a piece of paper that was written down that said, you give us that and you'll get this seat, that's against the law. Of course, it's not written down, but there's a pattern emerging which is increasingly problematic. And I do want to stress, I think it's really important with all of this that the problems are apolitical. The challenge to the next government, whatever flavour government that's going to be, is going to be exactly the same in terms of how you restore public confidence, how you protect our politics from capture, either big money or undue policy influence, and some of the other issues we're concerned about.
Sue, do you agree with that analysis?
Absolutely. I think the fact that the spending caps have increased by 80%, the thresholds for when you have to declare donations has not kept pace with inflation in the same way that spending caps have. I think what is going on for the next election at the same time is, the government have massively expanded the overseas franchise. Potentially an extra 3.5 million overseas voters are going to be voting. Those overseas voters can set up unincorporated associations who can give money to the parties. The people who give money to those associations don't need to be permissible donors. So we've got, as I think Wild West is absolutely accurate, and it's actually pretty scary in terms of foreign influence on our elections. And I think the trouble is, the root of it being about, can you have spending caps? And everyone says, well, then you need public money. And if you say to people on the doorstep, will you fund political parties? The status of politicians is so low, they're like, are you kidding? I'm not going to throw public money, at that lot. So I think we're in a real bind on that, actually, because we do need, to really talk seriously about caps, but we also really need to talk about the loopholes, closing the loopholes, like insane loopholes in the electoral finance laws. You can give a gift to someone who can then, give it to a party, and you could have been the greatest crook, or you could be Vladimir Putin, and as long as someone else gave the gift, it's okay. So there are lots of very serious problems.
So what I'm hearing is lots of things which are desirable and lots of obstacles to change. What I'm going to do now is I want to come along the line, and I actually want to ask you, given the obstacles you've yourselves identified, this doesn't play on the doorstep. It doesn't work for the person who holds the power. What is the one thing that you would want to do that you think might be achievable? And then when I've gone along this line, I'm going to open that up to others to comment. So Sue, I'm going to start with you. What I understand all the problems. What can we do rather than what can't?
I think independent oversight is really critical. And if you look at all the polling, we did focus group work with TI, and we've done polling, basically the public want politicians to be subject to the same kind of independent oversight as and regulations as most people are in everyday life. If you're in a profession, if you're in the police, people might question how effective it is, but they basically, independent oversight is really critical. And I think that Labour are talking about that with their ethics commission, that would be truly independent. And I think it gets around this issue of, this prime minister is king. And I think the danger is if people get into power and they realize how nice it is being king, they don't want to cede the power. But basically, I think we have to, hope that some of these more radical proposals, which really are on the agenda, if we get a new government, could start to percolate and would give the government more confidence. But they're going to need funding, and they're going to need political will to make them work.
So new government is really underpinning everything that you've just said to me. Daniel.
I think any government has got the answers in front of it. I think, we can talk ourselves into a terrible state of doom and gloom at sessions like this, but the solutions do exist. We need the political courage from wherever in the political system that's going to come from to bring forward these reforms. But it is difficult, and it requires very significant reform. I agree with what Sue has just said, and we've touched on two themes already. So for my one point that I will just throw into the general hopper of ideas that we haven't talked about quite so much is still more ambitious reform around lobbying, transparency, as well. We have a woefully inadequate view, really, of who is trying to influence government policy and for what, and the reforms that were accepted are very minor compared to what is really needed. I can get under the bonnet of the details later or in the margins if that's helpful, but that has to be part of the picture. You've got to tie standards and behaviour together with money and financing and influence on our central government.
Okay, and lobbying is probably something that can come to. There's an attraction on. There's not an absolute veto by government, I suspect, around that. Paul, just before I come to you, wave at me during Paul's comments if you want to come in on this. So, Paul.
A quick one, because otherwise we're going to just agree with each other, which would be rather boring. How many here have stood for Parliament? I know one. Yeah, I thought so. Thank you. Now, you will all recall that it was an absolutely critical issue that you didn't overspend on your constituency's campaign, because otherwise you're in court. And I, having stood several times, mostly successfully, but not always. I was watching every penny. That has gone by the board as a result of a deliberate act of Parliament pushed through by this government, because they can now spend $250,000, $500,000 in a particular constituency. And as long as the agent and candidate can say that they didn't know they were doing this, they could do direct mail from HQ, they can do calls from HQ, they can do social media campaigns targeted at particular constituencies where they have a best a chance of winning. So my quick one for this year, 24, not waiting for the new Parliament, is that instead of allowing the money to make the decisions, I think it should be millions of more votes, not millions of more pounds. What do? We simply make it a simple change to ensure that everybody who has a national insurance number is automatically on the electoral register. There are currently 8 million people not on the electoral register. Most of them, not exclusively, younger people, mostly male people moving around a lot. They need to be on that register if this election is not to be effectively bought. Now, that's an issue for now, which I think your challenge is to produce. I agree with what's being said here, but this is longer term. So in terms of what Sue and Daniel want to do, I want to do something now, which is automatic registration.
I'm going to bring some comments in from the floor. We're doing an odd dance with the microphones because we've only got 2. If you have difficulty hearing me without a mic, then please do wave and I'll make certain I'm always using them. Can I have gentlemen here with glasses?
Thanks, Phil Sullivan from the Electoral Reform Society. It was on lobbying transparency as part of the Electoral Reform Society in Scotland's work. We have to fill in a return for the lobbying register every quarter. I think it's every 6 months actually. It takes about half an hour. I wish it took longer because, you know, when we were campaigning with TI for this legislation, we wanted it to include spend as well, not just when you've spoken to a politician or a minister. Something that always concerned me when we were campaigning for it, and I've heard it in England as well, is that civil society, the voluntary sector and the community sector line up with the big lobbyists and big oil, etc., to say, oh, that's an administrative burden to have to complete the register. So I just wonder if it's like we're going to have to accept that we have to do this little bit of admin in order to get more lobbying transparency.
And just before I come back to Daniel on that, let me bring in this gentleman here.
Is there a way in which we can talk about the failings of certain politicians when it comes to integrity and standards without damaging politics as a whole?
So let me throw that one first at Daniel and then at Paul, and then I will come back round again.
There was some research that was conducted in the Republic of Ireland in 2015, which looked at the more whole-scale lobbying transparency reforms that Ireland brought forward that, for example, required, excuse me, all corporate lobbyists, so lobbyists on payroll as well as consultant lobbyists and in civil society, to provide full and meaningful lobbying disclosures. And the research was asking the question, has this had the chilling effect on the stimulative effect to democracy of effective and transparent lobbying that people were suggesting it would have at the time when campaigners like the likes of us were calling for more open lobbying returns in Ireland? And the answer was actually no, it hadn't really led to a particular change. So I think that's one of the arguments against the Westminster government's position that the statutory register of consultant lobbyists has expanded out to the rest of the lobbying industry, which is around 95% of people are actually lobbying government. I think there's less of a debate in England and Wales at the minute around civil society and the non-profit sector being part of that. I think we see the holders being bigger in the private sector. The Scottish Register is already more inclusive. So I think it's kind of a step ahead, and it's a bit of a model that Westminster should be looking at, actually.
Paul. I agree very much with what Daniel's just been saying, but I was involved in trying to make the Transparency Act in 2014 more effective, extending it. It was actually quite difficult, but at least it was the thin end of the wedge. You may remember a guy called David Cameron, I think he's still around somewhere, said that daylight is the best disinfectant. And we do rely not just on the law, but also the media here. I don't think the media have been that clever in trying to follow up what is available there and to be seen. And it's because guys like this do the work that we do actually get to hear a bit more about it. They're interested to know what a certain computer company did to get a particular contract for running the Horizon system for post offices. What did they do? It's a long time ago now. And the connections they had, where were they in all this? And I don't think the media have been very clever on this. If it wasn't for Private Eye and Computer Weekly, who would really expect that particular scandal to ever be exposed? Transparency is fine as long as there are lots of people taking a look to see what's there. But I don't think the legislation is the whole answer to this. And I think we have to be very much reliant on people like Daniel and his team. But that shouldn't be the whole answer. We should also have a more lively investigative media than we have.
So I want to again throw this out to the audience in a moment, but I'm just going to bring Sue in.
I think we need to go even more radical. One of the most radical bits of the Boardman and CSPL recommendations, actually more Boardman, was that there should be a principle of equal access and that departments should have to report on this. And if you think about the post office scandal, if Mr. Bates had got in a little bit earlier and not been fended off from getting to see ministers, you know, this might have been picked up a little bit earlier and the other side of the view might have been heard. And I think I agree with Paul on one aspect of what you said, which is we need more than transparency. But I also think that the media is also, we can't rely on the media as the sole accountability mechanism, because it gets to what Tom was asking, which is you get a whipped up sense of, you know, actually they're all crooked, you know, whatever. And, you know, basically you get a bit of a media frenzy. And I think quite a lot of MPs felt that after Westminster accounts, that there'd been a bit of unfairness, really. And so I think it's a really tricky, and it's a really essential question that Tom's asked, is how do you have the kind of media investigation without increasing cynicism? And that's why I think that independent oversight and accountability is so important, because if the public feels something's actually being done about it, then it can help assuage that cynicism that sets in.
So I want to come back to that in just a minute, but I'm going to bring in a couple more comments from the floor. I'm conscious this is quite a diverse group of people, and at the moment I'm only seeing contributions coming from men. If anybody else would like to speak, please indicate. I've seen the gentleman in. You were hiding, I'll come to you. and then the gentleman over here. Yeah, you have to sit within my line of sight as well.
Okay. Liz Crosby, Alliance Now. In terms of integrity, form follows function. We have to be clear about what we're asking parties within the system to do. The role of MP is extremely confused. People don't understand what expenses are for. They don't understand that essentially they're entrepreneurial businesses in effect. And there are ways where we could reform how MPs are provided with services, which would take away a lot of the challenges around who pays for the photocopying and, you know, and all the rest of it. So we have to be a bit more imaginative, I think, in terms of how we address some of these challenges. I spent a long time working with corporates where they are asked for their expertise by government because they do not have that knowledge internally. So there has to be a distinction between lobbying and information provision. So we need to think about that, because otherwise you're going to get really bad legislation if you turn off the tap of knowledge which is transferred. So that's that issue.
Thank you very much. Can I bring in this gentleman over here with the
yeah, I just wanted to get the panel's views on who would have the last say on sanctions for cabinet ministers, because last year Angela Rayner, when she brought in the some of the basic proposals for the Ethics Commission, she essentially said that the last word on sanctions would still ultimately rest with the PM as an elected leader. And, you know, some people put forward that, you know, some kind of commission or some kind of neutral body would have a role. And I mean, there's arguments for both there. I just wanted to get the view of whether keeping that, say, with the PM still keeps us in the system where how clean the cabinet is or how clean the political system is as clean as a person that leads it. And so you essentially come into that same problem of if you have a leader who does not have integrity, then that still filters down.
So I'm going to come back to the panel in just a second. I'll particularly ask you to pick up what you think of the current shape of those Labour proposals. The gentleman over here, and better grab that mic.
Good afternoon, all. Interested earlier in the question, in the comment about voting behaviour and it not being public standards not being a salient issue for voters. If so, you know, what did you make of Starmer's initial efforts at the new year to kickstart with standards being at the heart of the campaign? Is he going to try and make it a core issue in the next election? And should he?
So do you want to pick up? I'm going to start with Sue on those points. In particular, the point about, you know, have Labour getting the model right, but also that last point there and from the Labour.
Just to respond to that, you know, the importance of the private sector being involved. I think the point is that it's important that people outside of government are involved, and we get too hung up on it being the private sector, and there's a bit of a dogma that the private sector does everything best. So that's why the equal access thing is so important, because it's about the voluntary groups, it's about the, you know, academic experts. So I just wanted to, that would be my quick response to that. In terms of the Prime Minister having final say, my understanding is that is the constitutional position, you know, but the way you mitigate against that is that the independent body recommends the sanctions, and then it's on the Prime Minister to accept those sanctions or not, and then be held to account if they can't. I mean, there are other ways of doing it around, you know, getting Parliament more involved, but I think it's quite hard to get around that at the moment, and it would take some really strong constitutional thinking to break free of that. But I think that mitigating measure where, you know, the Prime Minister is regularly saying, okay, I'm not going to, you know, give that person a 2-year, you know, step down command, then they will face the consequences for it. So I think that's a debate, you know, is that enough? If it's not, what do we actually do about it? Because that is, I think, the constitutional position. I think, and it'd be interesting if you've got different views and you think it should be different. But I think in terms of Starmer, I mean, I think it cuts to this thing about that it is really, the public are really concerned about political corruption and really do feel that Britain has got more corrupt. I mean, people have seen the Ipsos polling just before Christmas, just 10% believe ministers will tell the truth. 9% believe politicians will. I think always the danger with it getting politicized is it becomes a bit of a political football. And I think, you know, the risk is that if you say, a little bit like Rishi Sunak did, I'm going to govern with integrity, you make yourself a bit of a hostage to fortune. And I think, you know, anyone who was around in the last Labour government will remember Tony's cronies, will remember the Bernie Ecclestone affair. This is systemic, and we need systemic solutions to it. And the test will be in whether those systemic solutions are forthcoming. The danger is that I think a little bit that with Sue Gray being so influential, that she comes from the system, which is it works as it does, you know, and it's working. And I think that will be the thing to watch out for, whether Labour slightly weaken their proposals and make it look a little bit like the existing model.
Paul, your book is called Can Parliament Take Back Control? And it's about the relationship as much as anything between Parliament and government. We've been talking about perhaps external ways of holding politicians to account. Actually, is Parliament doing its job? Is it able to do its job? And is there anything that we could do that would help?
Well, I agree basically where Sue is coming from on this. I think it isn't going to be as simple as people perhaps think. But the ministerial code is pretty clear. It's the way in which it's used is really a devastating thing. I mean, Boris Johnson said before it even started, to anybody looking at what Priti Patel had been doing, that she had his absolute confidence. And yet at the end of the process, he was the one that was deciding whether she'd done anything wrong. Well, no court of law would put up with that upside down bit of legal nonsense. So I think it's the way in which the thing is operating we should concentrate on first, rather than turning upside down. But I think there's a wider issue here, as Ben is really implying. Surely it is absurd that individual backbench MPs are held to a higher standard of behavior than ministers. After all, ministers effectively, on behalf of the nation, are taking on responsibilities beyond that of being an MP. So at the very least, I think the process should be as full of integrity as it is for MPs. Just want to take up the point that Liz was making, I think, at the back here, about some of the ways in which people misunderstand what happens. And it goes back to Tom's point about the reputation of Parliament generally. I do think it's a nonsense, actually, having been an MP and a chief whip for my party for a time, that each individual MP runs his own little business. I don't know what happens in other countries. I should do, I think, but surely we could make sure that the people who are employed by MPs individually could come through some sort of general process to make sure that they're looked after well, number one, and that they're doing the right job, number two, and a few other particular interests, rather than we left it entirely to the individual MP to employ who he or she wants. Because I think that's actually one of the reasons why Parliament gets a bad reputation, because these guys look as if they're sort of buccaneers on their own. And I think that a lot of the problems that have been seen at individual level, and it goes back to my point about integrity. The one MP that I'm aware of in this Parliament who has resigned on an issue of principle went yesterday.
So, Daniel, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just briefly on this point on the Angela Rayner interview, which I think I heard the same one on Labour's proposals. And I think the question I heard was, if the sort of upgraded ethics commissioner or independent advisor recommended to a Prime Minister Starmer that ex-minister should be removed, would he follow their advice? And her answer was a definitive yes. And I think that is probably the constitutional baseline. The difficulty with the current in that the Prime Minister makes the decision, but that is based upon a public recommendation to the Prime Minister, which has been independently generated and independently initiated. At the minute, to add to the problems that Paul has described with the application of the ministerial code, any investigation by the so-called independent advisor still needs the Prime Minister to ask for it in the first place. And we conducted research just over a year ago that found that there were, over a 2-year period, 40 uninvestigated suspected breaches of the ministerial code and the parliamentary code. And that's the problem that we've got to tackle with a stronger system. I just briefly want to make reference to some research which you may find interesting by way of follow-up to the ladies' points at the back on lobbying and corporate access, all of which I think is very valid. Just have a look on the Transparency International UK website for a report called House of Cards, and it looks specifically at the lobbying and political financing activity of the property development sector in the UK. And we find that 80% of all donations from that sector go to the current party of government. And that sector has an outsized footprint in the lobbying returns that we can see. Whereas, for example, over the 10-year period we studied, the rental community was completely absent in having a policy voice. And that's why topsy-turvy, opaque, politically financed linked lobbying is a problem.
So are there any further comments from the floor? Very brief comments at the back.
Peter Kenyon from Chartist Publications. I hesitate to remind everyone that in the 1848 list of Chartist demands, there was one for annual parliamentary elections. Thank you.
So there's a suggestion which fills anybody who knocks on doors with absolute horror. Gentleman there.
Just a quick question, I hope it's relevant, but my understanding, when my dad came here, he was qualified as a doctor. He had to do licensing again. And for most industries, you have to have a qualification. What fit for purpose tests do politicians go through? And shouldn't they be licensed? And if they do something which is corruption, then they should just be cleared out, because at the end of the day, we are the beneficiaries, they're the trustees. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to bring the gentleman in there. Just a brief moment ad. If you look at the Radix website, you'll find a paper which we have called Avoiding the Psychopaths, which is a proposal for job and person specs for MPs in a system by which you might at least get people to mark themselves against it. There's a difficult balance here. If you have an open election, then, are you able to rule out certain candidates? The gentleman over there with the beard, and then I'm going to come for one final comment from the panel, and then I'm a little bit over time. Sorry.
Thanks. So Jason Lehman, University of Sheffield. I'll kind of go back before the 18th century, take it back to Aristotle, just the ancient Athens and the virtues of public life, and the politicians try to be virtuous and have political standards in that way. And is there a room for a conversation around that sort of what it is to be a politician, what it is to be a public figure, and how we all do politics?
Brilliant. So in giving you one final comment each, you can either choose to respond to the comments we've just heard from the floor, and or you can tell me the one thing you want to whisper in either Keir Starmer's or Rishi Sunak's ear that you think might have an impact in this area. Shall I start with you, Sue? I'll start at that end, okay. Paul, I'll start with you. I have one thing to whisper.
Well, the first thing to do is read the book, of course. Look, democracy is not about training MPs, however worthy that might be. When I retired for the Commons, I tried to set up with two very distinguished members of the other party, Gillian Shepherd and, she's disappeared out of my head, but an ex-Secretary of State Education from Labour, to give training to the new backbenchers, how to be a good backbencher, not to just imagine that the only point of being in Parliament is to start being a minister, to be a good representative. Because that's the issue, isn't it? If we don't have good representation, which we don't have at the moment, then of course there is disillusion with the system. That's not about training people to be better MPs as such. It is to make them better representatives so that people feel more confident that the system is working for them, that their voices are being heard, their interests are being taken. That's one of the reasons why I'm so keen to expand the electorate to include everybody that's eligible. But that's the big issue at the moment. The lack of integrity in the system is not just about whether people are honest, it's about being confident that democracy is actually working effectively for the whole community, for the whole country. That's where we are at the moment. People don't have that confidence. And I am very strongly of the view that the major problem is that the overdominance of the executive. Let me just illustrate that. Very brief. When I wanted to train backbenchers, we were stopped by the whips, the then government whips and the main party opposition whips, because they didn't want MPs to be better backbenchers. That's the last thing they wanted.
Daniel, one thing you're going to whisper in which your chosen leaders ear.
Well, I would encourage sensible incremental reform. I think, like Paul, I am an optimist. And actually, if you look back over recent history, things have changed for the better, either as a result of scandal or some other incident. We only have the Nolan principles because of the Cash for Questions saga in the mid-1990s. We can make some of these changes if we, it's not all doom and gloom. And actually, history tells us that the reform tends to be incremental rather than revolutionary. But I think it's worth sticking with that and pursuing it.
What are you going to whisper in their ear?
Stronger rules and independent oversight, which is probably what Sue's going to say too, or what's to that effect?
I'm going to whisper democracy is seriously under threat from this. It's generating cynicism and really setting up problems for the future. So I would go for more ambitious reform and just get on with it.
Fantastic. I'm going to just whisper in their ear, remember it will be their turn soon. So protect yourselves. Can I thank our fantastic panel. That was a really great discussion. Sue, Daniel, Paul, thank you to you for joining in, and please let's continue discussion over the course of today, tomorrow, and with our elected representatives. Thank you.